God. Glory, glory, glory. He suffered it all because he loved me. Because he loved me by the Camden Baptist Church Choir. And once again, I've said before, I'm not affiliated with any denomination today. I don't think the church should be separated. I don't know if y'all know the history of the church and the Catholic Church and all this kind of business. I had time to go into all of that. But everybody believes something different, and they just go this way and that way. I affiliate myself. I'm a grace believer. I'm a mere dispensationalist. I believe the church started in Acts chapter 9 with the Apostle Paul. It was a mystery hidden God, kept secret from before the foundation of the earth. And that's what we've been going over the past, I don't know, now a couple months, I guess, hoping to open your eyes out there if you don't already see the revelation of the mystery of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, oh, he loves us so. He went to Calvary bearing the sins of the world on his shoulders, and he died and was buried and risen for our justification and for salvation to anyone who believes in his accomplished work, not of your own. We'll continue in the book of Romans chapter 4 where we left off last week. And I apologize, missing a couple of nights. It's July 4th. Most people were out busy eating and camping, cooking out and shooting fireworks and stuff. So just gave us a little break on that. I didn't take a break. I've done my studies even still. But anyways, I'm going to read what we're going to be going over in this study. I'm going to break it into two parts as I normally do. Otherwise, it'd be about an hour long. So chapter 4, verse 9 through, I think it was 17. Get your Bibles. And if not, just look on the board here. Unfortunately, Justin doesn't put the scripture on the board, so I suggest grab your Bibles. But for now, I'm going to just read through what we have here on the board. Cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had yet been uncircumcised. I want to mention that in other areas, circumcision is referring to a Jew, okay, and uncircumcision is referring to a Gentile. In this context here, it's actually referring to the procedure of a circumcision, to the male child, and this kind of thing. I'm not going into detail because I don't know what children might be listening or whatever, but some people might see this differently. But it is what it is. That he might be the father of all of them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of the circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised, for the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect. Because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which be not as though they were. Tonight, 17 or 19?
17.
Okay, alright. That's what we'll be covering these next two parts. We went over this before, but when I started using Justin Johnson, we just backed up a little bit because he might bring some things to our attention that I didn't cover. So that's why I backed up to 4, okay? Anyway, without further ado, I'll turn the class over to Justin. Get your pens, paper, highlighters, Bibles, and I'm right here in the back watching on with you. See you in a bit.
keep that in mind. Romans chapter 4, that's where we're at tonight. Romans chapter 4. I want to pick it up in verse 9, where we finished last week, Paul explaining how Abraham and David, we saw they were two pillars of the Jewish faith in their history. Abraham being one of the fathers, in fact the chief father, Isaac and Jacob being the other two, that were given the promises to Israel to have a kingdom on the earth, to have a specific piece of land on the earth, to be a mighty nation, and to have that blessing from God. Then David, of course, was given a promise also from God that he would have a king on his throne forever and that his kingdom would be everlasting. And so the king and the kingdom in David was promised. And so the Jews in Israel who would listen to Paul, who had a gospel to uncircumcision, to Gentiles, you could see where they would object, say, wait a minute, we've got exclusive rights to salvation, to the kingdom, to the king. We've got a heritage. Even if we are sinners, as Paul pointed out in Romans 1, 2, and 3, Abraham and David and the promise to the fathers should be upheld. In fact, all throughout Israel's history, you may recall that when Israel failed, someone in Israel always appealed to the promise God made to the fathers. Right? And after David, they would appeal to the promise God made to David to have a king and a kingdom established. And of course, God is faithful to remember his promises. And so the objection to Israel from Israel here is that we've got promises that even though we failed to keep our side of the bargain, God made promises to Abraham and David. And so we have some sort of privilege, some sort of advantage in our circumcision, in our heritage that goes back to Father Abraham. And Paul's trying to take that away. Remember in Romans 3 at the end, he says, where's boasting then? It's not by law, it's not by works, it's by faith, right? And so he took away those two things that Israel boasted in, and he starts chapter 4 dealing with what Abraham, the father of Israel, found about his flesh. Abraham, according to the scriptures, was not justified by works. We saw last week he was justified by faith, Genesis 15 verse 6 says. And it was before he was in circumcision. David even testified that when he committed adultery, murder, hypocrisy, and other sins, God did not count those sins to him. He did not impute sins to David. He forgave him, and from David's perspective, for no good reason, just out of his grace. And so he says in Romans 4 verse 6, David describes the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputes righteousness without works. Romans 4, 1 through 8 is the passage you need if you're trying to show people from the Scripture that God has always justified people by faith without works. And that's what Paul's doing. He's going back into Israel's Scripture saying, look at David. When he committed sins, God didn't kill him. God didn't say you're going to hell. He gave him sure mercies, which is what we studied last week at the end. Look at Abraham, who is the father of the nation of Israel. He's justified by faith without works when he was given the promise in Genesis 15, verse 6. Okay? And so that's where we ended last week. Now, Paul's going to start in verse 9 here about identifying to whom these blessings come to. Because when Paul says these people are justified by faith without works, again, Israel can claim, well, those are our fathers. David was our king, and Abraham was our father, so those blessings are remaining inside of Israel. John 4:22, salvation was of Israel. And so even if it's true they didn't have works as meritorious for their justification, it was still true that they were part of their lineage. And so Paul wants to make the point that Abraham was not in circumcision. Abraham was not under the law. He was not part of Israel when he was counted righteous by his faith. Okay? And so what he's doing here again is taking away everything that Israel says is our privilege. Remember back in Romans chapter 3, verse 1, where Paul asked the question, what advantage then has the Jew? What profit is there of circumcision? And he says, much every way, chiefly because they were committed to the oracles of God. So God gave them, he spoke to them. He gave them the oracles and the promises and the covenants and everything else. Now, of course, he has to ask the question because he's already proven them already under sin and unbelief. But according to Romans 3, they have an advantage. But when we turn the page to Romans 4, Paul's proving here that being an Israelite, being a circumcised Jew, has no advantage to justify you before God. And so again, it's so important to understand not just specific Bible verses, but where in Paul's book he's writing, where in his argument he's talking about. You can go to Romans chapter 2 and persuade somebody that their works save them in Romans chapter 2, where Paul says if you do good works, then you'll get righteousness and life. And if you do bad works, then you'll get condemnation. You can turn to Romans chapter 4, or Romans chapter 3 rather, and find that Jews have an advantage if you teach Romans 3, 1, 2, and 3. It's not until you read down later in the passage that you learn that that advantage is now gone. So there was a time in the past that Israel had an advantage, that they were the chief nation, that they were the one that had that spiritual privilege and that spiritual standing before God above all the nations. But in this dispensation, they do not. Okay, so Romans 4, Paul is walking us through that understanding. We end up in chapter 5, where he goes all the way back to Adam and says that we're all counted in sin, and it's only by the grace of God that anybody can be saved at any time. Okay, so that's where he's leading to, which of course is that mystery truth. So Romans 4, verse 9, he asks the question, comes this blessedness then upon the circumcision only? David was circumcised. David was under the law. So to say that God gave him a special grace, that's what Israel would expect from them being God's chosen people, that God would give them some sort of benefit, right? But Paul here is going back to Abraham saying, this blessedness, does it come upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say the faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. Now, he identifies Abraham here, of course, because David obviously was under the law, program, and circumcised. So he goes back to Abraham, the father of the nation, and says, well, how was it reckoned to him? How was righteousness reckoned on Abraham's account? And he's going to use a chronological argument here. Okay? So he's asking, is it to the circumcision only or uncircumcision also? Now, just as a parenthetical statement here to keep in your mind, do you remember in the book of Galatians, chapter 2? In Galatians chapter 2, verses 5, 6, and 7, where Paul goes up to Jerusalem and has a little sit-down with Peter and the 12. Remember that? And in Galatians chapter 2, there were people from Jerusalem who were trying to put Paul's audience in bondage by telling them they had to be circumcised to receive the blessings, to be part of the righteousness, whatever it was. Okay, and of course Galatians is all about that, proving similar things to what Romans 4 does, that the law and circumcision has nothing to do with your righteousness. Okay, but Galatians 2, 5, Paul says, we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Down in verse 6, those who seem to be somewhat, whosoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepts no man's person. For they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me, but contrary. And here's where you learn that Paul gave them some information. Contrary-wise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed to me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter, they gave, in verse 9 says, they gave us the right hands of fellowship. So in verse 7, notice the two gospels there. Okay, there's a gospel of the circumcision, which you can make an argument is slightly different than the gospel of the kingdom. Okay, the gospel of the kingdom was David's gospel, was the gospel that God gave to David when he said, I'm going to give you a king and a kingdom that will last forever. And so when Jesus comes saying, I'm the king and the kingdom is going to come, it's at hand, that's the gospel of the kingdom. Okay. The gospel of the circumcision goes all the way back to Abraham, where God promised Abraham that his seed would be his nation, his chosen people, the circumcised people would be part of his covenant above all the other nations. And so that had to do with the nation being above the other nations, not just a king and a kingdom that Israel had. They'd be above the others. Okay? And so this was a foundation for that kingdom gospel. So Peter's going around to the circumcision, telling them of the good news that the promise that was given to Abraham will be fulfilled in the Messiah, of course, as the king of the kingdom. Okay, so the kingdom gospel and the circumcision gospel go hand in hand, but Paul identifying here there's a difference between what Peter was teaching in his commission and what Paul is teaching in his commission. Peter was sent to the circumcision, just like Jesus, to the circumcision in his earthly ministry. Paul had a gospel of the uncircumcision. Now, pray tell, where in the Bible, anywhere, does God have good news to those heathen Gentiles that he called reprobate in chapter 1 of Romans? Nowhere. Nowhere do you find good news for Gentiles in the Bible. It's always given to his chosen people that he picked out of Abraham, the covenanted circumcised people, the nation of Israel, David, Those are the people that God works through and gives promises and benefits and advantages. The Gentiles, they got nothing. Ephesians 2:11 and 12, they were given up. They're without hope. Okay, the only way for them to receive blessing was through God's chosen people, right? Which, of course, they could at any time. But so in Galatians 2, down in verse 7, Paul here is identifying that he's got a gospel from the Lord to uncircumcision. It's not a gospel of the circumcision whereby the world will be blessed through them. It's a gospel to the uncircumcision, which tells you there's different content there. How can God give a good news? What good news is there for uncircumcision? Okay, unless you're talking about going through Israel. And so Romans 4, we're starting to learn about that, where Paul asked the question, when did this righteousness get counted to Abraham? When he was circumcised or uncircumcised? And we're going to see the beginning of this gospel of uncircumcision. Because there's a difference, folks. There's a reason why in the book of Genesis that has spent so many chapters just on Abraham's life, because things change in his life. You ever wonder about that? Genesis 1 through about 9 or 10 covers like 2,000 years of human history. Then in Genesis 12 through 29, you got one guy's life. Okay? Because he's the father of Israel, but we'll learn today he's also the father of all them that believe. There's important things that happen in his life that we need to account for. Okay? So Romans 4, the question on the table is, when did the blessing that Abraham, we've already proven Abraham got when he, by his faith, was counted righteousness by God, in verse 5, when did this come upon him? He says in verse 9 at the end, for we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. Now, the we say there, obviously, he's talking about his fellow Jews. He's talking about Israel. Anyone who read the Scripture, read Genesis 15, and they know and they've said that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. They all know that. James even said that in James 2. Okay? He just moves on to circumcision and works. But so this was something that they could read, they could know. This is not mystery information. Paul's just walking them through how God is right and just to do it. Okay? He's not breaking any of his promises by giving blessing to Gentiles. Okay? And so how was it reckoned? In Genesis 15:6, of course, the answer is in verse 10. It was reckoned when he was not in circumcision. It was when he was in uncircumcision. Right? And so that's when God, in Genesis 15:6, said it's counted him for righteousness. So on the board, I have a really detailed look at that part of the dispensational chart that we often just draw Abraham for. But here we're talking about Abraham's life and his sons and the changes that happened in here. Okay? That's what we're looking at. In Genesis chapter 12 is the first time that God gives Abram a promise. And I intentionally put Abram because his name was Abram at the time. It wasn't Abraham. He wasn't circumcised. He wasn't under the law program. He wasn't a Jew. Okay? He wasn't even a Gentile, because a Gentile implies there's a Jewish nation somewhere. He was a guy on the earth that God just plucked out and said, I'm going to give you a special grace and a promise. Why did God choose Abram? There's no reason. There's no reason. There's no works that he said, I'm going to choose you because you're a special guy. No, he just chose him. It was by the election, by grace, as Romans 9 and 10 will explain. Okay? So it says in Joshua chapter 24 that his parents were idolaters. Okay, so again, God chose Abram and gave him a promise in Genesis 12. Let's go back there real quick just to remind ourselves of it. And Paul is asking this question to the folks who are coming back saying, hey, we've got scriptures that give us a promised advantage. And he's saying, well, let's look at those scriptures. Let's go back to the beginning, Genesis, and see what happened in those scriptures. The Lord said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, Genesis 12, verse 1, and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. A blessing to who? The other people, right, on the world. Verse 3, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curses thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so that's the first time God gave Abram this privilege, this grace, this honor, that there's nothing he has to do to get it. God just said, I'm going to do it for you. Okay, so he obeys them, and he continues on. In Genesis chapter 15, God promises Abram a son, which he reiterates in chapter 13. And in chapter 15, Abram's a little curious why he hasn't got one yet, going, look, God, we're pretty old, so maybe you just got this one wrong. And of course, God confirms with him that, no, I'm going to give you a son. And he says down in verse 5, he brought him forth abroad and said, look now towards heaven and tell the stars, count the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. So the question is, when was Abraham counted righteous by his faith? Which is how we've already shown he was justified. Genesis 15, verse 6. His name was still Abram. No law was given. He wasn't even circumcised yet. Way back here, he was counted righteous by faith. No works. Another question will be useful later is, what did he believe in? It was not in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It was that his seed would be innumerable like the stars. It would number like the stars. Just 15, verse 5. So God here is reestablishing the promise he made in Genesis 12 to Abram. Abraham believes, and God counts his faith for righteousness. So we can see very clearly, it's a very simple argument Paul makes, that, well, if you think this is this blessing of righteousness by faith without works is only for circumcision, when did Abraham get it? He wasn't circumcision. What an offensive thing that is. Okay? Because Abraham is the father of Israel. He's one of the fathers. He's the guy that Israel looked for as their identity. But John the Baptist comes in Matthew 3 and says, God can create of these stones children of Abraham. So just because you were born of that doesn't mean much. It's hard to find an example for us to illustrate that to us in 21st century America, especially when we try to boast in our country as being a melting pot and we're so much individualistic and not so much caught up in lineages anymore. Back a few hundred years ago in England, there was a lot of that going on with the kings and everything else. But the closest thing, it's really a bad analogy, is to think about and consider the rights or the privileges you think you have as an American. And what if someone told you that you don't have those just because you live in America? Just because you're a citizen of America, that doesn't mean you have those. Would that be offensive to you? Wouldn't you pull out the Constitution? Wouldn't you say, wait a minute, look at this. I've got these things that said right here. Okay, and that's what Paul's doing to Israel. He's pulling out their Constitution, their scriptures, and saying, you don't have privileges just because you're circumcised, just because you call yourself a Jew because you're an Israelite. Okay? And so there's something here where Paul is trying to reveal a greater truth about how all men are saved, even Israel. Okay? And so he's doing that by taking away their advantages. So again, just to reiterate before we move on here, Romans 4, 9, and 10, Abram, or Abraham, as Paul calls him, was counted righteous by his faith in what God told him before he was circumcised in Genesis 17, hundreds of years before the law came, which we'll see in a bit. And it was when he was yet uncircumcised, he was counted among the other people of the world. Okay? Now, that's where you see the seedling of good news to uncircumcised people. He was uncircumcised. And God said, I'm going to bless you. Right? God said, I'm going to count your faith in righteousness while he was uncircumcised. And so from here on out, anyone who's uncircumcised down here, couldn't they say, wait a minute, God did it to Abraham, why can't he do it to me? Right? That's what Paul's pointing out. Ever since Abraham in the scriptures, God became more and more exclusive and made it more and more works-based and more covenants and more things added to it, added to the promise. And so there became this distance, this separation between Israel and the Gentiles. And Paul's saying, look, there's no difference anymore. There's no separation. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. God justifies all men by faith without works in this dispensation of grace. Just like Abraham, when he gave him righteousness by faith, for no reason by grace. There was no reason back here. Okay. By the way, when God gave the promise to Abraham and said, your seed would be a blessing, and eventually he says the same promise to Isaac and Jacob, there are more people coming from these people's families than what's on the board here. But how often do you hear in the scriptures the fathers of Israel being Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Okay. The point being, and we'll get to Romans 9, 10, 11, that the promises given to Israel about their land and their nation and their kingdom was narrowed down to a specific group of people. Okay. Abraham had more sons than Isaac. Didn't he have Ishmael coming off here? Wasn't he his seed as well? And what about Isaac? Didn't he have Esau here? Wasn't he his seed as well? Okay. And so weren't there people in Israel that didn't enter the promised land? And so you see there's lots of people that don't inherit the promises, don't inherit the covenants. But we'll get to that a little bit later here. Look at Romans 4, verse 11. So far we've seen that the righteousness imputed by faith without works was given to Abraham when he was yet in uncircumcision. Okay? Point Gentiles, right? Romans 4, verse 11. He received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith, which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. So a couple things here to point out is, first off, Paul calls circumcision a sign, which is a proper scriptural thing to do when, quite frankly, a lot of Israelites, a lot of Jews would count that as the reason why they deserved privileges, because they were circumcised in the flesh. They had that lineage. And Paul says, no, that's just a sign. That's just what Genesis 17 calls a token. Back in Genesis 17 is when Abram's name was changed to Abraham from high father or mighty father to father of many nations, is what the names mean. But Genesis 17, down in verse 7, I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee, in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. In verse 8, he talks about giving them a land for an everlasting possession. I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, in verse 9. therefore thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. And this is my covenant. He talks about the circumcision in verse 10 and verse 11. And so down in verse 11 is what I want. Ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. Now, what God promises to Abraham here in this covenant of circumcision sounds a lot like what he already promised him in Genesis 15, 13, and 12. That's exactly right. Okay? So what he does here is, as this circumcision, this act, this flesh sign that's going to identify these people as inheritors of the promise that he already made and gave to Abraham. Do you see what's going on? Genesis 17, God said this is just a token. It's a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. So did the circumcision mean anything in itself? No, not at all. It meant diddly squat. God already made a promise to Abraham. He can't break that. Okay, he made it back in Genesis chapter 12. So Genesis 17, he makes the same promise. He calls it a covenant and says, you're going to circumcise your man-child or I'll cut you off the covenant. Okay? And so it's a token.
Doesn't that make that a requirement more than a token?
Well, sure, it's a requirement, but the promise had to happen. We'll get to that in a little bit here, Jim, where he talks about it had to be a promise or had to be a faith or else the promise does not effect. But Genesis 17, God already made the promise in chapter 12 and 15. He already made it. And it says in verse 11 that the circumcision is a token. A token is a sign or a seal. Okay? We put the sign on the road out on the street. The sign is not the road. The sign is not the way. It's just a sign. Okay? It's a label. Take the label off, you can still drive on the road. Right? A seal, what does a seal do? It's just a confirmation. You get a letter from the government, and it's got some sort of stamp on it. This is an official letter from the government. Does that seal mean anything? Or is it just the contents of the letter that's changing your life? You're audited by the IRS, It's not the seal, it's the content of the letter, you see. It's the same thing in Genesis 17. The token is nothing. It's the promise God made that he uttered a few verses earlier. What's the circumcision going to do to give them an everlasting possession? Nothing. God promised to give them an everlasting possession. Well, sure, it's a token. That's all. It's a sign. It's a seal. That's all it is. That's what Paul's point is that the circumcision was a sign and a seal. So neither one of those, a token, a sign, a seal, that doesn't make someone righteous. That doesn't mean that they're going to have an everlasting possession because they circumcised their flesh. Okay? And so that's what Paul's pointing out here. Again, he's trying to undercut the idea that it's works, it's by circumcision, it's by the law that you inherit the righteousness by faith. Okay? Now, back in Romans chapter 4, down in verse 11, he says, Abraham received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had already. So when he circumcised his flesh, he had already been counted righteous, right? The circumcision was in Genesis 17. When was he counted righteous? In circumcision, he's already established that. Genesis 15 was when he was counted righteous. So what's this all about? It's a seal, it's a sign, it's a symbol of what he already had. He labeled himself, I'm circumcised now, partaker of the covenant that I already had, the promise I already had. Okay, it's just a seal, a sign. And of course it says in verse 11 that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised. His point there being the all them that believe, because it was just a seal of something he already had, which means all the people back here who are not circumcised, all the people over here that aren't circumcised, they can trace any sort of blessing that they get from God back to Abraham as a precedent, as an example, saying God gave it to Abraham by faith without works. He wasn't circumcised, you see. That's exactly what Paul's doing here. So that he might be the father of them. Now, when we say father, this is something we need to clarify, because people stumble over this passage in the book of Romans, and they stumble hard. Because in Romans chapter 4 here, this is where they think Paul is making the church Israel. They think Paul is teaching that the church gets grafted in, becomes part of, or is part of the New Testament given to Israel, and they make a mess of things because they don't understand the difference between the mystery and prophecy. But in Romans chapter 4:11, this is where it begins the confusion. Because Paul starts talking about Abraham being the father of all of them that believe. The question which comes to your mind then, what does it mean to be a father? And typically when people think about Father Abraham, what they're thinking about is this, the law, Israel, Jacob, Isaac, circumcision. And so that they think, when they think of Father Abraham, that, if I'm a seed of Abraham, if he's my father, then I must be true Israel. I must be part of the real covenant. I must be the true circumcision, And so what these are just a picture of me, That's not true. Paul's not making that point at all. In fact, Paul's tearing this stuff down. He's saying it's not the law, it's not circumcision. When was it counted to him for righteousness? Back here, when he was uncircumcised, no law, right? What does it say about you? If there's any relationship you have to Abraham at all, it goes all the way back before Israel, before the law, before circumcision, right? And so you cannot say, I am now Israel, okay? Which is exactly where people stumble over this. But Romans 4:11, he says he had it when he was uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all of them that believe. Paul's not saying here he's your father because you're true circumcision, you know. That's not it. He's saying that he had it in uncircumcision, of course by faith, that he will be the father of all of them that believe. The father, by the way, is in the sense of imputed righteousness by faith. That's what Paul's dealing with here. Chapter 4, he's talking about God imputing, counting righteousness to you by faith. We're back up in Romans 4, verse 5. To him that worketh not, but believes on him that justifies the ungodly, not the godly, not the church-going, not the circumcised, the ungodly, undeserving person God justifies, his faith is counted for righteousness, right? And Paul's question that we're trying to answer here is does this blessedness, this righteousness imputed by faith without works come upon just Israel and the circumcision? No. The answer is no, it doesn't. It can come upon anybody because of Abraham, right? And so for someone to say Romans 4 makes me Israel, makes me circumcision, that's ridiculous. They're missing the entire argument, okay? And so Romans 4 verse 11, the father of all them that believe. He's the father in the sense of when it was counted to him for righteousness. Question, and this is going to help us a little bit later. What was Abraham promised in Genesis 12, in Genesis 15, in Genesis 17? To have a land, to have a nation, to have a blessing above all the Gentile nations, right? That's not the issue, folks. The issue here is when God counted his faith for righteousness. You see, there's a difference. What people will inevitably do, and I have a commentator, a well-known commentator, who makes this clear statement in his commentary, wrongly, that what they will do is because they see that Abraham is our father, that somehow now we inherit the land promises, the nation promises, and the new covenant promises. That's not true. Paul is talking about imputed righteousness to you by faith without works. He's using Abraham as a precedent, as the father of that. Okay? So, by the way, he couldn't use David for that. There's a reason why he doesn't use David for that. Because David was circumcised every day of his life, except for 8, you know. That was the law. He had to be circumcised the 8th day. So David was a circumcised Jew. Abraham was uncircumcised for a lot of his life. Right? He wasn't a Jew and there was no law. So there's a reason why he's using Abraham here. Meanwhile, he's the father of all them that believe. Not all of them that circumcised or do good works, all of them that believe. Though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. Do you see the point? When I just said there, he's not talking about the land promises or the new covenant promises. He's talking about the righteousness imputed to them by faith. That's something that, if you're not paying attention, you skip over in Genesis 15. Because the big deal back in Genesis is the beginning of Israel and the covenants and the land and all that stuff. You skip right over it. That's why it was a mystery. It kept secret since the world began. But Paul points this out saying, wait a minute here. God put that verse in there for a reason. Right? It was imputed to Abraham by faith before he was circumcised. Verse 12, and the father of the circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only. So notice here in verse 11, Abraham, because he received righteousness counted to him by faith, uncircumcised, is the father of all uncircumcised who are imputed righteousness. Do you see that in verse 11? Abraham, because he was given righteousness counted to him by faith, in uncircumcision, he's the father of all uncircumcision who received righteousness by faith without works. Right? He's the first. He's the father of that, you say. But in verse 12, he's also, this is a different fatherhood. He's also the father of the circumcision. Okay, so we got the father of the uncircumcision, but he's the first guy the circumcision was given to. So Abraham has 2 fatherhoods. See, he's the father of all those who are uncircumcised and the father of the circumcision also. Okay. In verse 12, the father of the circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. What in the world is he talking about there? Remember I pointed out to you before, when Abraham was given this covenant of circumcision, aren't there people in their lineage after him that are circumcised that aren't Israel? Consider this. Genesis 17, circumcision is given, and that's to Isaac. How many kids does Isaac have? A few. Jacob is one of them. How about Esau? Was he circumcised? The covenant was you had to circumcise all your male children. Esau was circumcised, right? There are people who are circumcised who are not Israel. Okay, what's the deal with that? He's the father of circumcision, also to those who are not circumcised, but walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham. Okay? Look at Ephesians 2:11 and 11 through 13. When we need to realize when we read through our Bible and God chooses a special people out and gives them a covenant and says, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to give you salvation, all this business, he is not forgetting about the majority of the planet. Okay, when he called Abraham out, he's one man, and Israel's a small country. There's a lot of other people on the planet. Could they get saved? One of the most popular questions that stumps people is, how in the world do Gentiles in the Old Testament get saved? I thought only Jews could get saved back there. Wrong. Salvation was of Israel, yes, but it was provided for everybody. If a Gentile wanted to seek God out and get salvation, he can get it. Okay? And where are we at? In Ephesians chapter 2:11, we see here that the Gentiles were strangers of the covenants made to Israel. Verse 11, remember that ye being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision, by that which is called the circumcision. So Paul's alluding to the time past back here that, quite frankly, doesn't go back to Abram. Circumcision started here. So Paul's starting back here with the uncircumcision, the circumcision, the uncircumcision difference. These people here, okay? So he says, who are called uncircumcision by the circumcision. At that time, verse 12, you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise. You have no hope without God in the world. Okay? Pretty clear statement. They had no advantage in themselves. But how were they saved? How could they get righteousness before God? As Job asked. Okay? Well, the answer is through the circumcision, through Israel, through God's provision. Okay? Look at John chapter 8, verse 39. Romans 4:11 says he's the father of the circumcision, but not of them only, but of those who walk in the steps of the faith of Abraham. It would have been a problem if God said, circumcise your male child, and Abraham said, nope, ain't going to do it, God. That would have been disobedience, you see. Walking in faith does what God instructs. And so Abraham, who had already been counted righteous by faith, was continually to walk in faith when God said to circumcise your son, and so on and so forth. Okay? Men of faith do what God instructs. And in John chapter 8, Jesus identifies this. Faith has always been the issue, folks. That's what we're trying to point out here. John chapter 8, down in verse 39. The Pharisees did not get this. The Pharisees claimed Abraham as their father. And they answered, said unto him, Abraham is our father. Jesus saith unto them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. Jesus clearly is identifying people who should be walking in the steps of the faith of Abraham. All right? And so those who did what was necessary by faith, those are the people that Paul is saying can be justified by faith by Father Abraham. Okay? Gentiles who came to Israel by faith and blessed them as God's chosen people, as Genesis 12 says, they were doing what God instructed them to do. Men of faith would do that. All right? And we see example of it. Look at Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. Jesus came to Israel, his chosen people, and how many times, you got a few recorded in the Bible, did a Gentile come up to him, exhibit the faith, walked in the steps of faith, did the works that faith required, and Jesus said, whoa, you're blessed. You're not even circumcised, but I'm going to bless you anyway. Luke chapter 7, verse 9. Now again, you have to be careful here, because when you start talking about Paul going to Gentiles, these are the verses that people bring up. Oh, Jesus taught the same thing. Look, he blessed a Gentile here. They're totally missing it, you see. What did Abraham believe again? He believed that his seed would be like the stars. He didn't have any faith in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He didn't understand that. Okay? Jesus did not teach the gospel of the grace of God in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. God had always a provision for all men on the planet. Even in Israel's program, even when he had instituted circumcision, the uncircumcision could still bless them and get a blessing. Okay? Men of faith would do what God instructed. Luke chapter 7, verse 2, a certain centurion's servant who was dear unto him was sick and ready to die. And when he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him that he would come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they besought him instantly, saying that he was worthy for whom he should do this. Why was he worthy? Because he walked in the steps of the faith of their father Abraham, who did what God instructed him, who believed in hope against hope that God will fulfill the promise that he said, Genesis 12:3, that if they bless you, I'll bless them. If they curse you, I'll curse them, right? If you're a Gentile, that's what you're following, okay? The people who are blessing Israel today, hoping to get a blessing, are exactly right in the wrong dispensation. You hear what I'm saying? If they're Gentiles, they should be blessing Israel if they're under this dispensation. But they're not. We're in a different dispensation of grace, where there's neither Jew nor Gentile. But Luke 7, verse 4, the Jews come to Jesus, because the Gentile couldn't, and they say, this guy's worthy of it. This Gentile is worthy of your healing, for he loves our nation, and he has built us a synagogue. You see there? So here's the Gentile walking in the steps of the faith of Abraham, yet being uncircumcised. On what basis can that guy get a blessing from the Messiah given to Israel? By his faith, folks. By his faith. Look at Luke chapter 7, verse 6. Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying unto him, Lord, trouble not thyself, for I am not worthy thou shouldst enter under my roof. He's a Gentile. This is not a Jew here that he's going to heal. Wherefore, neither thought I myself worthy to come unto thee, but say in a word, and my servant shall be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, having under me soldiers. And I say unto one, go, and he goes, he obeys. Just like God told Abraham, go, and Abraham went. And he said, circumcise your son, and he did. Like God told Abraham, sacrifice your son, and he was gonna. Right? Walking in the steps of the faith of Abraham does the works that God tells the man of faith to do. Now, again, let's remind ourselves, when was Abraham's faith counted for righteousness? Before any of that, right? When God told him not to do any of that. Okay, but Luke chapter 7, these people here, verse 9, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at them. And here's this Gentile who's obedient to his master, who blesses Israel, and he's ministering among his chosen people and can't find anybody that actually has faith in him. But this guy, Jesus says, I say unto you, have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. You see that? How did he know his faith? By his works. Because a man of faith will believe what God instructs him to do, and God instructed these people to bless Israel. Right? Jesus said, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel. Right? He can see them by their fruits. You see the difference here? So back to, let's look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 and 12. Isn't this?
All right, I guess we'll stop it right there. That's about the midway point. All right. And again, you can go directly to their site, and you can watch all these videos that we put out there. We just try to cut them in half because I know people's schedules are busy. But you can go directly to graceambassadors.com or .org. .org. graceambassadors.org and watch all these videos and more. But I would suggest starting with Romans 2 Philemon. That is the doctrine for today, for us specifically today. And the whole Bible's for us, the whole Bible's for us, but those are specifically to us today. All right, and I think that's all I've got, and I hope y'all have a wonderful evening, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. Bye-bye.